Welcome in, my friends, my Romans, my countrymen. Lend us your ears. It is basketball by association. My name is Arky. That is Joel Cordes. Joel, what is up, my friend?
Well, I'm not your Roman or your countryman, so I guess I qualify as friend. Glad to be here. This is episode 55, believe it or not. And normally, if you're new to the show, folks, normally how this goes is we name our episodes after a player, and typically I'm the one picking said player, and we vacillate between well-known or maybe some sort of personal connection to purposely obscure. And usually I'm picking them live as we go on the air because I'm generally irresponsible about picking said person ahead of time. However, today we're flipping the script a little bit because we have picked the person ahead of time, and it is Arky who has demanded vociferously that this episode be named after one certain player. He would not let me name it after, Eric Williams or Dwayne Shinsius or David Wingate or any of these other guys who wore 55 during their career. There's actually a lot of 55s in NBA history, but for Arky Shea, there's only one number 55. Arky, I'm not going to steal your thunder anymore. Go ahead and name the episode.
White chocolate, baby! Ow! Yeah, the good white chocolate, by the good Jason Wood. That's who we're going for, okay? We're going with, by the way, the 55 is a good number because it's it's 5-5. Like, that's a cool looking number. So I can see why a bunch of people would want 55, but this is the Jason Williams episode, brother.
Yeah, we're not going with the Jason Williams back here from the New Jersey Nets. This, of course, is Jason Williams of the Sacramento Kings, most famously, and also the Memphis Grizzlies. Had a decent career, a decent stint there, and did win a championship in Miami at the end of his run. A little bit shorter of a career than you would expect, and shorter of a prime than people think, yet one of the, I think, all-time NBA YouTube stars. Like, Jason Williams' game was not only built for SportsCenter, but was built for the YouTube highlight reel. And you and I were talking off the air last week before we pre-decided this one, and you lobbied for Jason Williams. I can't think of too many guys who are more fun in the YouTube highlight reels, except for maybe like Sean Kemp, Blake Griffin. But Jason Williams is up there. I mean, probably top 5 YouTube reels, right?
Oh, easy. And he would have been built for social media run like that. All those clips that would have happened of him just making defenders look silly. Oh, it's just like full game, totality of the game. Not nearly as good as the highlights, but the highlights were. I was watching a video probably 4 weeks ago, and it was like 9 minutes of all these just silly highlights that he had. And like I watched it twice, to be fair. One time I watched the stuff, but the second time I just paid attention to the crowd reaction.
Yeah.
Oh man, that's fun stuff, man. Just listening to the fans react to that guy, and part of it's like, oh man, that's a great play, and part of it's like, that white guy just do that? What's going on? What's happening over there with Jason Williams?
Yeah, there's that little bit of like that Pistol Pete flair going on. Certainly the truth of the matter is that Jason Williams was an undersized point guard who you absolutely could pick on defensively, and he was. He was a very streaky three-point shooter. Even back in the early 2000s, the three-point shot, of course, did not have the same weight that it does today, or at least the same prominence. But he was a guy who would go very hot and very cold. But the ability to break down plays, to make wow plays, and then it's not just that Jason Williams was so flashy and so entertaining. It's you stick him on the Sacramento Kings with Chris Webber, one of the great all-time passing forwards, and Vlade Divac, one of the great all-time passing centers. And then you get a guy like Peja Stojakovic knocking down threes. You get some Doug Christie in there knocking down threes. They had some other guys, a young Gerald Wallace as somebody who could really finish a play above the rim. And certainly Chris Webber could do that before the knee injury. And you've just got this recipe, like this time and place in NBA history, like certain teams, the Showtime Lakers or the 7-second or less Suns, that are just fun, or even like the Doug Moe Denver Nuggets, to go, way back, that just were made for highlights. And of course, they racked up enough wins to be credible too. But you saw it, I think, when Jason Williams, he had some injuries at the end of his Kings run, much like Chris Webber did, and was never quite the same player. But you put Williams on the Grizzlies, for example, and yeah, he was still an adequate NBA starting point guard, but the magic just wasn't quite there, right? You'd still get the little highlights, but it wasn't the same group of guys that could just feed off each other. So I think Jason Williams is part of what made the Kings, and the Kings are kind of what made Jason Williams too. And you put him in a Rick Adelman offense where everybody's going to touch the ball. It's very egalitarian. Rick Adelman offenses were always kind of fun, and he just let them play. And it's just, it's a chef's kiss recipe right there.
So watching that entire 9-minute video, there were a couple of highlights that were like, oh, that's fine. But that's not the Jason Williams I was just watching. Those weren't Jason Williams Sacramento Kings highlights. Those were Jason Williams Memphis Grizzlies or Vancouver Grizzlies highlights, and a couple of Miami. Yeah, a couple of Miami. But yeah, you could, to watch the sort of maturation of hair and style, and of course the fewer highlights for each team that he would have, was kind of sort of interesting to sort of watch. So this episode is dedicated to White Chocolate himself. Man, such a God. That dude would have gotten so many retweets. Like, from me, and I don't just retweet highlights. Sometimes I'm just like, that's all right, I guess. Those are fun, But for someone who's not a dunker, like who's not posterizing people, whose highlights are assists, I mean, it's freaking phenomenal, man. It's phenomenal. So, this one goes out to you. We hope we do you proud. So let's start things off with hot team, shall we? Right. How about the Orlando Magic? Not being the hot team, even though they're the Chumo Kikis. But they are the team that gave up a lot of pieces to teams who are warming up in the standings. One of those being my Denver Nuggets, by the way, who are looking better and better as we continue on the season. Joel, let's just start off with the hot team. So right now, the NBA doesn't feel like they've been hot the entire season, and warming up a little bit. The Celtics are warming up pretty nicely too. The staying power, we don't know, but some teams are starting to warm up at a real good time for it. We're getting into April, or in April.
Yeah, let's talk about Denver first. They were your pick to come out of the Western Conference and potentially even win the NBA Finals. And of course, that did not look like a good pick about a month into the season, but it's slowly been gaining steam even prior to the trade deadline. And now it's to the point with the arrival of Aaron Gordon, where I think a lot of people are jumping on the Arky Shea bandwagon here and are starting to talk about Denver again, because 8-2 in their last 10 games. And Gordon looks like such a seamless fit in Denver, in that he's another guy who can finish a play for Nikola Jokic, but he doesn't need the ball in his hands all that much. So he's not going to steal Jokic's touches. And it's a unique setup, of course, when you have a center who you're going to run the offense through. There are teams that do that, but you have to have guys that kind of thrive only getting the ball in certain points of a possession, certain moments of the possession. And you and I have wondered aloud on this show, what is Aaron Gordon actually good at? Like, what does he thrive at? And he's never really been elite at any one thing. However, you're starting to see different facets of his game shine a little bit more here in Denver, where he's not expected to be like a main offensive focal point like he was in Orlando. He doesn't need the ball in his hands, but when it is, bad things aren't going to happen as long as it's not too much. But Aaron Gordon as a backdoor cutter is what's really standing out to me during these first few games in Denver. And I've purposely started watching the Nuggets a lot more here than I was earlier on in the season, just to kind of see what was going on with Gordon's arrival. His ability to cut backdoor when the defense falls asleep because they're paying attention to Jokic. And of course, the Jokic Jamal Murray high pick and roll, which is a staple, or Jokic trying to set up Michael Porter Jr., when the defense falls asleep, Gordon has been very adept at getting to the rim, and Jokic, of course, is one of the best in the biz at finding people doing that. And just that extra threat where the defense cannot fall asleep on Gordon because he's going to make them pay is opening up Michael Porter Jr., who has had some big scoring games, throughout the season, but now seems to be finding his groove as well because there's not as much defensive attention on him. And the same thing then opens up for Jamal Murray. So Gordon's arrival is just an injection of further talent. It allows Will Barton, Porter Jr., guys coming off the bench now like JaMychal Green, who had been in the starting lineup. Monte Morris is healthy again. Don't discount that because he's a guy who gives them some combo guard minutes. He can play with Jamal Murray as well. The Nuggets suddenly look deeper, and it allows guys to slide kind of back onto the second unit where they're not playing against such high competition. And it allows, I think, the Denver Nuggets starters to just breathe a little bit more and have a little less focus on what they do. And now all of a sudden there's just this the offense looks like it's very in sync. Whereas early in the season, Arky, you and I talked so much about how Denver just looked like they were grinding through Jokic, having to go through read after read after read, and it just looked like it was in mud, right?
Yeah, it did. It looked like this offense was as stagnant as it could possibly get. It looked nothing like the offense we were seeing in the bubble, right? Or the majority of last season. It looked like it was just stuck in neutral, and we just couldn't sort of get ramped up at any point. And that's why it was so disconcerting to watch them start 3-7 or 3-8 or something like that. It felt like every possession was much more of a chore than what we saw last year. And I think they really have been able to come on, not just with Aaron Gordon. Aaron Gordon's sort of been like a little, I wouldn't say cherry on the top, because they can definitely use someone like Aaron Gordon, but a piece that makes them go from fourth to fifth gear, right? That makes you believe they can compete deep into the Western Conference Finals like they were doing last year. Now this team looks like that offensive juggernaut and threat. Orlando game last night aside, they look like that threat that can completely disrupt what people were thinking and used to going into this season, except for me, of course. And they look like a really good, well-oiled machine now, and it's Joel, it's night and day from what it was 3 months ago. It is just completely different, and it's really it's fun to watch again. Really,
it is. And Gordon gives.
Sorry, by the way, that's my bad. Go ahead.
Gordon gives them a dynamicism that JaMychal Green, who's a very solid across the board player, doesn't have, and Paul Millsap doesn't have anymore. But you don't lose what JaMychal Green or Millsap brings to the table. They're all kind of these, 6'8", 6'10" type of forwards, and you got Michael Porter Jr. in there. They're all very interchangeable at that 3 or that 4 spot, depending on what lineup you're going to trot out there. They all can hit a 3, even though that's not necessarily their forte. Porter Jr. is, by reputation, the strongest of the snipers from that group. But I think it's that ability to kind of trot out the same body size with slightly different skill sets among that group that's going to be really helpful for Denver. Now, again, when they get into a matchup, let's say with a fully healthy Los Angeles Lakers team, if that ever happens, and you still have to match up with LeBron and Anthony Davis, I think you're in better position now that you have Gordon there, because again, you don't have guys that are going to be immediately outsized on the front line, which is what was happening to Denver last year when it was just Jeremy Grant as the only guy who could handle that. So that's where I see Denver. I don't know that they have an advantage over those teams, but LA may not be healthy, and that's really the only matchup on paper that scares me for Denver still. I think everybody else you look at and you go, yeah, Utah, Phoenix, the Clippers, Portland, Denver's got a really, really good chance because they're creating as many matchup problems as they themselves have to deal with.
I think that's a great point, Joel. I think you bringing up the fact that Denver didn't need Aaron Gordon to be a contender, right? But I think Denver looked at Aaron Gordon as a piece that if they're looking and projecting out toward the playoffs, and they were clearly feeling like they're comfortably going to be in the playoffs, they're just sort of future casting for what they may need the rest of the way. That I think they felt really good going up against everybody except for possibly that healthy Lakers team, that Aaron Gordon helps you immensely in that case. That I don't think Denver's scared of anybody. Matchup wise, size wise, shooting wise, I think Denver, and listen, the Lakers may end up beating them in whatever kind of series, but it's going to be close. Like whoever that they're going to play, like it's going to be close, and all it takes is if you bounce the ball one way or the other, and it wouldn't even take luck for Denver to be your Western Conference champs at this point. That's what I think the Aaron Gordon pickup does for them, is that it does give them extra ammunition and firepower and matchup power when it comes to going against. I think the Lakers are probably the only team that they probably saw any of those pure deficits up putting on the court, and I think they addressed that nicely. And I think that's why Aaron Gordon, for me, is the best pickup of any of the teams at the trade deadline, because I think they made themselves. Listen, I picked them to win it, so I think the favorite. But if nothing else, like they're going to be at worst a small underdog against anybody. And I think that's all you got to do is you give yourself a fighting chance. And Denver has a fighting chance against anybody out of the West.
And what allowed this trade to happen, because they really, when you think about it, didn't give up all that much to get Aaron Gordon, a guy who had fallen out of favor in Orlando, had lost a lot of luster, a lot of the upside kind of reputation to his game. So they give up Gary Harris, they give up Isaiah Hartenstein, guys that were not moving the needle. And Gary Harris was a high draft pick for them who really had a nice rookie year and has kind of been in a slow decline ever since that. But they didn't need Harris because Monte Morris has more than proven that he can play with Jamal Murray and play bigger than his size. Facundo Campazzo, who they got from overseas, has shown that he can handle backup point guard minutes behind Jamal Murray. But even a guy like PJ Dozier, who's a youngster who really, early on looked like he was in over his head, but now has been given more and more minutes as another kind of lanky swingman who is filling time behind Michael Porter Jr. and behind Will Barton. The rise of those guys and the ability to pick up JaVale McGee kind of off the scrap heap from Cleveland allowed Denver to move some areas of overlap that they had and address an area of need. And that's exactly what you want to do. And it's a testament to the fact that Denver was deep before this. They just traded out different parts of depth for, again, an area that they needed to address. And I think it can pay huge dividends for them. And that is exactly, when you want to talk about segues here, that's exactly the segue of what Boston needed to do as well, right? The Celtics have looked better now over the last couple of games. They struggled in Evan Fournier's debut, especially where he didn't score a single point. And of course, Celtics fans must have been weeping and gnashing of teeth at that point. But have looked a lot better now that he's kind of settling into that role. And we had said it over and over. Boston had plenty of depth. It was just too much depth at certain spots and not nearly enough at others. And Evan Fournier coming in immediately becomes their third or fourth best scorer on that team. But he's coming off the bench with that second unit that has struggled not to play competent basketball, but has struggled through power outages of points. And Evan Fournier's best years happened when he was with the Denver Nuggets as kind of a sixth man type. That's what got him the huge contract in Orlando. And then he was required to be a starting top level guy and a leader of that team. And he did okay, but that's not really where he's going to be best positioned. He's going to be best positioned. And now, especially as a guy who's kind of got the wisdom of 10 NBA seasons under his belt, to be able to come in and exploit second units, and he also gets to eat. Like, he is the shot maker out of that group, but he's not selfish either. He's just going to move the basketball when it's there. And that makes somebody like Marcus Smart better when he's on the floor with him. That makes somebody like Kemba Walker better, who you've seen them setting up Walker with kind of some nifty backdoor cuts because the defense can't pay attention just to Walker dribble drives since Fournier is going to do it. And it sets up other guys like Grant Williams and, Mo Wagner and stuff like that. And don't overlook the fact that like Romeo Langford is finally healthy and played his first game the other night too. So Boston, we said they needed like some length. They needed some scoring punch from that guard position, especially the backup guards. And now all of a sudden it's here. And suddenly the Celtics don't look terrible. Granted, it's only 2 games of sample size that they've won in a row.
I don't want to pour all the water on this immediately. And I have a question for you after I tell people about Manscaped. I do want to say that I thought it was hilarious that Romeo Langford gets in and like within the first 15 seconds commits a turnover. Right. And they commits a turnover by getting, I think, a pass thrown at him right in front of Brad Stevens and then steps on the line. You're like,
that's called rust. Right?
Not the most fortuitous of starts. That is called rust. Don't you remember the lines? That's out of bounds. This is inbounds. Come on, Romeo. But first, let me tell you about Manscaped and our good pals at Manscaped who can save you 20% off anything you want on their website, and they'll even pay for the shipping. That's right. I'll pay for some of it. They'll pay for the rest of it. All you got to use is our promo code. Manscaped is the numero uno people in personal grooming. The Lawnmower 3.0 with the skin-safe technology to protect your regions. That's all the regions of your body, your personal body. That's right. You don't want any nicks and snags in the wrong places, even though I should have gotten those nicks in Minnesota last week. Regardless. Manscaped right now can save you 20% off and send you free shipping. With that, the Lawnmower 3.0, there is nothing not to like. That's right. 7 negatives in that one, I think. There is nothing not to like about manscaped.com, and part of the proceeds go to charity. Why not be cool like that and get your personal grooming taken care of at manscaped.com? Use the promo code BRAWL, BRAWL. That gets you 20% off and free shipping. It's manscaped.com. Promo code BRAWL, BRAWL. Joe, the Celtics' first 2 games were against the god-awful Rockets and the Hornets, who were missing 45% of their scoring. So, yes, it's 2 wins, and that is nothing to be trifled with in the NBA at this point. But how much can we really feel comfortable with the white-hot 2-0 Celtics since the trade deadline? Well, actually, not since the trade deadline. Since, I guess, Fournier actually made his debut. How much can we feel comfortable knowing that the Celtics may be able to creep back into hell, I don't even know where to say at this point. They're what, eighth in the East. The Knicks have the tiebreaker over them right now. Like, it's about to get hard. Like, the 76ers are in town tomorrow. The Knicks come in town Wednesday. And then they get your stupid Timberwolves. And then they go to Denver and Portland after that.
Yeah, we're going to find out real fast. It's not just who they beat, of course, but it's how much better they looked when people were able to settle into their roles and, be adequately fulfilled against higher competition. We're certainly going to find out. But as we said before, there was so much being asked of Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, especially in the scoring department, when Brown is supposed to be your number 2 defender behind Marcus Smart. Marcus Smart was not healthy through most of the year. Now he's back and looking better, aside from some headbanging plays the other night. So that allows Brown to kind of expend a little bit less energy on the scoring side when he doesn't have to be the guy working with the second unit. Kemba Walker has been in and out of the lineup, but there's a lot of rust being shaken off. And when used in the right, I think, deployment, when he's got Marcus Smart on the floor with him and at least another good defender out there, he's shown that he can be productive and helpful. So it's about not overtaxing those 3 players and allowing Jason Tatum to be like the third or fourth best defender on the floor at any given time, and not at, you're kind of hiding him, but also not having to be the guy scoring 60% of your points in any string of possessions. That's where Fournier helps so much. Robert Williams continues to get better and better. I love what Peyton Pritchard gives to them, kind of as a guy who's just making the right plays, and as another one of those like undersized hustle point guards like TJ McConnell in Indiana, who, yeah, he's got his flaws, but your possessions just tend to be better when he's out there. So there's depth behind Walker if he's got the wrong matchup or whatever. What was happening before this, however, was that you were having to play Peyton Pritchard and Kemba Walker together, or Pritchard and Jeff Teague together, and you're too undersized. Fournier is not an undersized guard, and again, he's not an all-world defender, but he's been around the block enough times that he can be part of your defensive scheme and not a guy that you have to like scheme around. Like, hey, what are we going to do when Evan's on the floor? We got to make sure we've got some help for him. It's really, yeah, he should be able to be a net neutral as long as he's up against the other team's, third best player out there. We should be fine. So it just allows people to settle in to more comfortable roles. Now, again, is that good enough to beat Philly or Milwaukee or Brooklyn? Probably not at this point, unless they gel spectacularly. But should that be enough to make them a lot more competitive against Atlanta, Miami, Charlotte, who's fading fast because of all those injuries? Now they're without Gordon Hayward. Your Knicks, they're going to be in a dogfight. Indiana and Chicago and Toronto, maybe even Washington, are all still in this mix. Boston before this was so inconsistent on a night-to-night basis against any of those second-tier teams. You'd be like, yeah, maybe they'll win. I have no freaking clue, right? I don't even want to put money on the Celtics because I have no idea. But now, theoretically, you look at them and go, they really should be the favorites against any of those teams except for maybe Miami or against Atlanta if Atlanta's completely healthy, which has not happened for the Hawks all season. They're just that deep to keep going. So that's the difference, but we're going to find out. Like, I think a game against Portland where you're up against some really, really good guards, that's going to be a big test. When you see the Nets and their guards, that's a huge test for everybody. But that's what I want to see, is when you're up against these teams that have a lot of scoring punch in their backcourt and swingman positions, how do the Celtics fare there? Because that's where I think they were getting killed before.
Yeah, listen, count me as one of the many that doesn't have the utmost confidence in Boston going forward, especially against the Knicks. Jill just saying that Boston will be a favorite.
All I said is they have their work cut out for them. Is that really so controversial? let me ask you this. Let me ask you this, because you asked me, like, I think it was 2 weeks ago, about Brad Stevens being on the hot seat. And I said, no, it's too early, not enough time. But now a couple weeks have passed, and that was, of course, pre-Evan Fournier trade, pre-deadline shakeup. And a few people are out there, the usual talking heads are like, oh, Brad Stevens is on the hot seat. Well, there's no actual credible anything to that beyond speculation. But let's say that Boston continues to play this inconsistently, and that not only do they not make the top 8 seed, let's say they still make a play-in series and get bounced early in the play-in, or maybe they make it to the second round of the play-in, but it's just a collective crapping the bed for lack of a better term here, when this was supposed to be a top 4 seed. How big of a hot seat do you think Brad Stevens is under at that point?
I think it's huge, only because of the market and how long it's been since they've won a title. Like, I don't think so. I think since the I guess one of the first iterations of the big three, since Pierce and Garnett and Allen, that I think that team and that franchise got a little used to winning again, right under those guys. That when Brad Stevens came in and those guys were filtering out, and you're getting the new studs like Tatum and Brown, and you're trying to sort of figure out, like it's a franchise that hasn't made a lot of moves under Danny Ainge. So when you get a Kemba Walker, you think that's a huge deal, and it turns out so far it's kind of a big deal in spurts, but kind of not a deal for large chunks of the season. And then time will tell when it comes to Fournier and what that move ends up being for them. But I think that there's a lot of that fan base and a lot of people who think that Boston is underperforming. And I would think that's fair to say when this team, with the Eastern Conference Finals last year, was a team that was in the top 3 for a good chunk at the beginning of the season and then just went south fast. And Kemba's had the same injury issues basically the entire season and most of the playoff run last year. So it's not like that's brand new to this season. It's just been like that team hasn't sort of gelled and connected. And if you watch this particular iteration of the Celtics, you see a lot of heads down after mid shots, a lot of lack of effort at times. You see a lot of quarters where, like third quarters especially, where they'll just get run and you wonder where were the adjustments. Like you just don't understand why Brad Stevens, who's coaching this team for pretty near a decade now, like why he's unable to get these guys over that hump. And why I don't know if it's self-motivation. I don't know if it's something Brad Stevens isn't doing, but it feels like when things do start to tumble downwards, that they go fast for this team. Like there isn't a stopgap guy that can shut it all down and just get things going back in the positive direction for long periods of time. I mean, this team struggled to beat bad teams this year. And we sort of were wondering, like, why are you beating like Minnesota by like 4 or something like that? What you should be able to beat, like that game against Charlotte was one of the first games I've seen in a while that I wondered why we haven't seen this team more, which is Charlotte was missing a lot of its offense. Good. Yep. You should kill them. You should kill that team. Like if half that offense is gone, you should beat them by 30, right? That's the whole freaking point. Like,
yeah, not only do you not have Gordon Hayward and LaMelo Ball, obviously, but you hold PJ Washington and Mikal Bridges to, I think, like a combined 6 points between the two guys. So
yes, like it's a bad team, right? And like so, like that's the team. I think a lot of people were wondering, why doesn't this team beat bad teams, beat them more, and not be in this position where with 20, 21, 22 games to go, that they're fighting just to get into the playoffs, much less seeding. So yeah, I do think Brad Stevens would be on at least very, very, very questioned, especially if if a big name showed up to be available, or a I don't know. Sometimes a change is just necessary, and maybe you wouldn't do it for like an assistant or for like someone you never heard of, but you may do it for a bigger name coach. I'm trying to even think who would be that kind of option. Give me a second. Let me think of somebody.
And that's just it. Like,
I mean, you can say something. I'm just trying to think of like.
Yeah, but I mean that is the question. Like, who is out there that's a clear upgrade? Unless there is an assistant who is kind of lighting the world on fire and deserves that type of chance. A guy whose name keeps coming up is David Vanterpool, who is with the Minnesota Timberwolves, he's in line to get a team. Sam Cassell is another one that is in line, and Cassell is a former Celtic, to get a team and get their shot. I will say this, like, if it's bad enough that Brad Stevens would actually be on the hot seat, and I think the scenario that I kind of laid out there would be enough to make that happen at this point. If he's on the hot seat and you're thinking about firing Brad Stevens, if you're ownership, I just make a clean swipe of it. I fire Stevens and Ainge together, and I bring in a new GM and a new coach. And you hit that reset button a little bit as a message to the whole organization that, we're turning a fresh page. You get that new voice if that's what you wanted. You get that new approach. But if you're Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, like, hey, all right, now you've got to really impress somebody because you're not their guys anymore either. And I'm not putting too much onus on those two because of the huge load that they've carried so far this season. But when you're the number 1 and 2 guys on a big market team, that is how it goes. So I don't think that the answer is firing only Brad Stevens. The answer could be firing Danny Ainge and then giving Stevens one more year under a new GM to see how that goes and letting him make that decision. But I'm more of the mind that if you're so disappointed and then they've been that disappointing, then it's time to just let the axe swing freely.
Yeah, I think the more likely move would be firing Ainge, just because of he's the guy that puts the talent together, right? He's the guy that puts
he's been there so long. He's been there so long,
yeah.
even more than Steve.
Yeah, so I think if you're going to make that move, if you're looking for a little freshness, Danny Ainge has done a great job of making some really sneaky good deals that's gotten you someone like a Jason Tatum and a Jaylen Brown before in the draft where you've been able to do that. But this was the first time he'd made a trade deadline move in like 7 years or something with the team. Like, it does feel like that there is sometimes a little bit of inactivity there. And even though it may be the best case for the team, the best move for the team, a lot of people feel like inactivity leads to sort of complacency and that you may just sort of be complacent. Look, some people have given up on this team already and said, let's just see what we got for next year. Because a lot of people don't believe this team can compete for the Eastern Conference. And I'm one of those guys, by the way. I don't think this team is good enough to take on a Brooklyn or Philly for a long series. And I think they'd be out 5 or 6 games anyway. But, you know, I mean, that's a scrappy team that I didn't think would be in the Eastern Conference Finals last year.
Yeah, I think if everything broke right for them, they feel like a team that makes it to the second round and that's it, right? They have a good first round series, maybe a really competitive one. Maybe they got to do the play-in round and they're able to get out of that because, frankly, they still are more talented than most of the other teams that they would face in that play-in round. But then depending on matchup, like maybe they're good enough to pull off an upseed if they're a bottom, a 5 through 8 seed. But probably not. They almost need to get up into that 4th or 5th seed to be able to ensure that they're going to play one of these other second-tier teams. And then I think they have as good of a shot as anybody. But yeah, as soon as they get to those top-tier ones, but let's be honest here too, I don't think there's a single second-tier team with the exception of Miami, and some of that is based on reputation because they made it to the finals, but some of that is based on we've seen Miami play spoiler before. And not just last year,
right,
but in previous seasons and this season as well. How many of these other second-tier teams do you really look at and go, yeah, I think they're good enough to beat the Sixers or the Bucks or the Nets? Like, outside of Miami, I just don't see anybody, although maybe Boston or maybe Atlanta, if they have the series of their lives and something really goes wrong for one of those top 3 teams, I just don't see it otherwise.
We're talking about a team I wouldn't bet on at all, right? They were 11.5-point favorites, I think, against Charlotte, and I wouldn't even touch it despite Charlotte being out for it. Like, there's no Gordon Hayward, there's no line. Like, like I said, missing half the offense. We're also talking about a team that's one game out of hosting a playoff series. Like, we're murdering a team that's one game out from being in that 4th spot and hosting first round. But we're also looking at the matchups and what they have on the roster and saying, like, yeah, right now they seem okay, but that's right now. We get to the playoffs, we'll see. But again, that Celtics team still one game out. They're barely in the playoffs right now as an 8th seed. One game out of hosting. It's funny. It's just funny to me. Every time we talk, it's like 4 through 8, 9, 10 are just like accordion all next to each other.
And so the narrative can change kind of in a heartbeat, especially if Boston winds up with a top 4 seed. And then we walk out of that going, yeah, well, we thought they were a top 4 team all year long and they had their ups and downs, but eventually they got into being a top 4 team. It can change in a heartbeat. And I mean, it's a testament to all of these teams in the Eastern Conference. It's not just that, it's watered down, because that's the that's the initial impression you might think because they're all hovering around 500. But it's like, no, these teams all around 500 have been good enough to beat and lose against each other consistently all season. And there is something to be said for that. Like, every one of those teams, with the exception of like Washington, who's really just hanging around on the fringe, and now Charlotte because they're so banged up, like every one of those teams in that bunch feels like they're conceivably good enough to win at least one playoff round, depending on matchup, right? And that's especially because we didn't expect certain teams like Boston and Atlanta. Yeah, they should have been there, and they should probably have a better record than they do. Same thing with Miami. But like New York, we didn't really expect them to be in this position where they were good enough already. And they have been. They've exceeded expectations. So I'm actually really, and this is the first time I can say this in a long time, but even if it's like Chicago or Indiana that gets in, they've got their redeeming qualities. Toronto has some redeeming qualities and has really just been dealt a bad hand due to injuries and COVID. Like, I'm looking forward to the first round of the Eastern Conference playoffs for the first time in a long time, because there are some really intriguing matchups where you go, I don't really know what I'm going to get out of this.
Yeah, I think outside of the what the 10-9, 7-8 loser versus winner, winner versus loser, like sort of play in sort of a side of it, that like there's going to be a significant amount of, oh, that matched up interesting. I feel more comfortable that the East is, I don't think it's anybody can win it. I think it's probably max 4 teams could probably win it. But I do think that there could be some interesting series that go longer than we were expecting based on a lot of the matchups that are happening now. Because like you said, there's a lot of these teams that you can just beat up on each other because they're not that far separated talent-wise or coaching-wise for that matter, that you know, it could be, you know, we could be looking at longer series for your 4-5, 3-6 matchup kind of thing, or you may see a 7 get through and then win a 2 games against a 2. Well, probably not this year. Never mind. But you can get some good matchups, yeah.
It can, and you know, that'll be a fun betting exercise, of course, to try to pick those games. It will in the Western Conference where teams are so talented. But you don't have to wait, of course, to the NBA playoffs to make bets. You've got the NCAA playoffs wrapping up this evening, and there still is time. You still have some time. If you go to dkng.co/brawl March, you head over to the Sportsbook promos page, you click boost the event, and you get 100-1 odds on the national championship game. You just have to be there before tip-off this evening. 100-1 odds. Eligibility restrictions apply. dkng.co/brawl March. And of course, if you miss out on that, or you don't want to bet NCAA men's basketball, if you want to bet NBA or any of the other sports that they offer, just go to dkng.co/brawl. They've got all sorts of different specials and promos that they're running over there. Just make sure to use that link. It helps us here at BbA. It helps Brawl Network. And we thank our good friends over at DraftKings. So dkng.co/brawl if you want the kind of plethora of different promos that they have, or if you're betting on the men's national championship game, /brawl March.
Yeah, we'll have this episode up because that game I don't think tips till like freaking 8:30 or something tonight. So we're Central Time.
Yeah, and that's Central. So yeah, it'll be. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Good luck seeing all of that, East Coasters. By the way, my Knicks are playing Brooklyn. By the way, tonight, 6-point underdogs because James Harden's back. That changed the line from like 4.5 to 6. So James Harden been fighting hamstring, neck issues, all kinds of things. Kyrie's been playing. So having Harden and Kyrie tonight's going to be. I never bet against the Knicks, but if you want smart money, well, again, I'll never bet against the Knicks. Just like last week when we got off the air.
Yes, let's talk about that.
By 3.5 over your stupid Timberwolves, and we're leading by like a dozen to start the fourth quarter. And then guess who sends a text with about a minute to go in the game when someone's Knicks happened to choke it all away. Riggs! Riggs! Yes, it was the fan of the 11-win Timberwolves texting the team that's going to the playoffs to win the Eastern Conference Championship. Hey,
there
are you watching
dozens
this?
of us. Dozens.
You texted me, hey, are you watching this? And I wanted to throw my phone. I wanted to throw my phone. It looked like an easy cover.
I mean, timing is really the essence of comedy, which is why that was sent at that moment. I knew you were watching the game, but we hadn't texted back and forth, and we had talked about even doing a live broadcast during that game, and it kind of opted out of it. I had to work that evening, and it on paper, the Wolves have found so many different ways to lose all year. They've been in a lot of games. They've also just been blown out of the building in multiple games. But this was one of them that of course, because Arky was involved and the universe has a sense of humor, Anthony Edwards did enough. There was enough there. Jalen McDaniels had some good plays as well. They did enough to sneak back into it, because it's not just that the Knicks were up by a dozen, like going into the fourth. It's that the Knicks had been squarely in the driver's seat, like pretty much the entire game. And Minnesota would climb back a little bit, and then New York would pull back away. But, in the grand scheme of things, besides maybe some money having been on said game, and your pride in the grand scheme of things, it really means nothing. I don't think it did anything to change New York's trajectory, which has been a 500 team, right? A better than advertised team, but still young enough that they make some mistakes. They still go through some offensive power outages, and Minnesota still is sitting at 12-38, 3-7 in their last 10 games. And, trying to develop some of the younger guys like McDaniels and like Anthony Edwards, but yet another lost season where there was the hope that with D'Angelo Russell and Karl Anthony Towns and the number one pick in Anthony Edwards and the arrival of Ricky Rubio to be the backup point guard and enough youth there was the hope in Malik Beasley, who had really looked good last year when he was brought in from Denver, and to his credit has been like a 20-point per game scorer. There was the hope that they could be a fringe playoff team to at least get close to the play-in side of things, like a 9-10 seed, and give themselves a chance, and that would have been enough to say it wasn't another lost season in Minnesota. And yet, D'Angelo Russell has hardly played. Towns had COVID, has gone through a lot of personal issues with losing, members of his family. He's dealt with a wrist injury, so they've been in and out of the lineup. Beasley went to prison for a stint here during the season and now is back. Anthony Edwards has looked like a Rookie of the Year candidate on some nights, and more often than not of late, but early on in the season really was struggling to kind of find his footing. And there you go, another season for Minnesota where you're looking at 12 wins. And the moniker, they officially became the worst U.S. team in pro sports over the last 40 years. They've passed the Clippers now. They've passed a couple of the other teams that were in that just for winning percentage over that time. And I've been there with them since I think 95 was the first season that I really started watching, and they've been around since 89. So haven't been there quite from the start, but masochism is a thing, I guess.
Less than a week before, your Timberwolves lost to the Rockets by like 30.
Yes, after having beaten them like a night or two nights before that, by the way.
And you're telling me that isn't rigged? My Knicks to lose that game?
No. The Tom Thibodeau revenge game.
No.
Most of those guys were not around when Tibbs was there, but Karl Anthony Towns sure was. And most of those players are not fond of Tibbs and his stint in Minnesota. So that's all I can hang it up on.
Hey, real quick, less than a minute or so on these last two things. I just think it's interesting. One, we haven't talked about the fact that since we spoke, the Raptors beat the Warriors by 53 in a game. Now, there was no Steph Curry in that game, and there was no, I think Draymond was out of that game too. But it's still hard to beat another NBA team by 53. Like, I think the third quarter, I think it was the third quarter shoot, maybe in the second, that the Raptors outscored the Warriors by 32 in just that quarter. It was the third quarter. Holy smokes.
Yeah, and Kelly Oubre is not a top 3 player on a roster. I think he's proving that. Andrew Wiggins really isn't either. And if those are your 2 lead guys, you're in some trouble. But it's not really that they played all that awful. James Wiseman has been looking like he's hitting the rookie wall right now, which is understandable. A lot of rookies do that. His career, all that is not in jeopardy. But a lot of this goes back to the fact that Golden State's bench has looked better at times and then way worse at times. It's a really young group. It's a lot of unproven guys. Damian Lee, Mark Mulder, and then Kevon Looney is back in and out of the lineup at times, which doesn't help because that should be a solid guy with that second unit. They're given some, major minutes at the backup point guard spot to Nico Mannion now. So it's a big work in progress. And it just goes to show you that, like, when Steph is there, when Draymond is there, they're good enough to be a 500 team in the West right now. They're in the hunt for a playoff spot. But there's a lot of nights where the bench doesn't play well, or Kelly Oubre has a really off night. Andrew Wiggins, to his credit, has been, like, consistent all year long as a scorer, at least. But there's not enough depth there. And then when you take out the top 2 guys and everybody has to step up a notch, that's when bad things happen on the nights that they're not playing well, and that just happened to be one of those nights. So Golden State has been a conundrum all year long. I've been a believer in them, but they need those guys healthy more often than not to be able to go anywhere.
Yeah, by the way, at one point they trailed by 61 in that game. 61. Final thing. Let's do a minute on it, because I think I know where you're at on this, but it's just a contract signing. Drew Holiday signed a big $160 million contract now to stay on with the Bucks. Thoughts on him committing longer term to Milwaukee?
He's 30 years old. He's had injury issues, yet people swear up and down that he is one of the best, if not the best, guard defender in the NBA and doesn't get credit for it. He's also a very unselfish player who hits threes, can get into the lane. So as long, and this is always the caveat, but again, 30 years old, as long as he stays healthy, a long-term deal like this should age pretty well because his game is not based on like blazing athleticism. It's enough athleticism, but a lot of kind of street smarts and game savvy that all mixes together into a very above average guard. The only way this deal looks bad is if he gets hurt or, heaven forbid, Giannis decides to leave and now you're stuck with Drew Holiday as like your lead guy, which we've seen in various iterations with the Pelicans when Anthony Davis got hurt or when he left. Drew Holiday cannot be your number 1 player. Arguably, he should be your number 3 player, and that's kind of what you're getting as long as Chris Middleton is still in the fold there in Milwaukee. So I have to imagine that Bucks management kind of sought out Giannis a little bit on this just to say, hey, how do you think you guys are gelling? This seems like a guy that could be long-term, right? And with some sort of blessing, you get that. And kudos to Drew Holiday, who has played kind of unsung work, whether he was in Philadelphia and especially in New Orleans. Kudos on him for getting that payday. He's earned it. And hopefully he can be part of that process that brings a championship to Milwaukee and keeps Giannis there for his entire career, because that's, I think, what we all ultimately want to see, unless you're a Lakers fan or a Knicks fan or the Heat, all of these big market teams that just think they're entitled to MVP candidates walking through the door.
The Knicks have one. Julius Randle. Come on, brother. You listen, he's nowhere on the boards, but dude, he's money 2021. That's all.
You can make the case for Randall that there have been few players more valuable to their team than what he has been to the Knicks, right? And again, yeah, go ahead.
I was just saying, without Julius Randle, this team is nowhere. So,
right.
All right, that's it for Basketball by Association. Joel, we'll be back for our BbA bite at the next time we speak. So in a couple of days. In the meantime, tell people where they can go find the video feed of this thing too.
Of course, we're on YouTube. So if you're listening to the audio only version and you want to catch video, search BbA or Basketball by Association, and we will pop right up on YouTube for you in live and in living color. Well, maybe not live, but in living color at least. And if you're watching the YouTube version, you want audio only for whatever reason, check us out on Spotify, iTunes, wherever you get your podcasts. And coming up on our next show, we're going to be joined by author Bob Kuska, who has written a book called Shake and Bake. No, it's not on the Will Ferrell and John C. Reilly pairing, but on Archie Clark, who was kind of an unsung guy in the early NBA. However, it's kind of a, 7 Degrees of Kevin Bacon type of thing where he's around a lot of landmark things that happened in the NBA Archie Clark was involved in. So it's a really interesting kind of interweaving of different NBA tales from the early days. And we're going to get Bob's take on the recent passing of Elgin Baylor and what he meant to the early league as well. And we'll talk to him a little bit, that age-old question of, could a player today have thrived in those early eras and vice versa. So really looking forward to having Bob on our next episode, which will be the BbA Bite coming up next. Episode 55 is in the books, Arky Shea.
Hope you like the white chocolate.